let's unpack this. Welcome, everyone. We're doing a deep dive today into, well, the very structure of how we think. Our mission, really, is to get some quick, critical knowledge about the hidden architecture behind how we categorize things, how we as observers actually construct meaning just by making a distinction. And the title kind of says it all, the persistent unmarked state. The insights we're digging into come from Harish. He's a lifelong learner, really passionate about reflection, exploration, shares some fantastic stuff on cybernetics, systems thinking, lean statistics. He's also active in CyberSyn. That's a really vibrant community with exclusive resources, books, podcasts, forums. Great place if you're into these ideas.
Yeah, and this is it's a powerful dive, almost philosophical, you could say. We're looking at the absolute basics of observation grounded in systems thinking. It's moving beyond just saying everything's connected. We're asking, how does that connection even start in our perception?
Yeah.
It really goes back to work inspired by Spencer Brown's laws of form.
Yeah.
Looking at the simple, fundamental act that creates all meaning.
Okay, that sounds maybe a bit abstract. Let's try and ground it. We're looking for a simple tool, right, to understand the complexity we face every day.
Exactly. And we start with the most basic operation there is for an observer, making a distinction. Just think about it. When you make a distinction, any distinction, you're creating a boundary. And that boundary separates what's inside from what's outside. That's the foundation.
Right. So if I decide to focus on the hum of my computer right now, I am in that instant creating this whole other world of things I'm not focusing on. The traffic outside, the feeling of the chair.
That's precisely the mechanism. Spencer Brown gave it a formal name, the mark. Every single act of indicating something, choosing to focus it simultaneously, creates two necessary parts. There's the indicated thing, and then there's the non-indicated. The distinction itself he called the form.
Okay, and that single act gives us these two fundamental states.
Correct. The first one is the marked state. That's what you're actively observing, what you've put your focus on. The source calls this content. Then there's the second state, the unmarked state. And this is crucial. It's what cannot be observed right then because you're observing the marked state. That's the context.
That distinction, content versus context, it feels like more than just saying A and not A. If I mark A, I get A and not A. Why isn't not A just absence or nothingness? We call it the enabling condition.
Because the unmarked state isn't just empty space. It's the rich, necessary background. Think about a word printed on a piece of paper. The word itself is the marked state, the content. But imagine if the page was exactly the same color ink as the word.
The word would just disappear. You couldn't see it.
Exactly. The white page, the background, that's the unmarked state. The context is the enabling condition that gives the marked word its definition, its contrast, its meaning, really.
That really makes me pause and think. If the background, the stuff we aren't even looking at or maybe can't look at simultaneously is what defines the thing we are looking at, how often do we mistake our specific observation, the content, for the whole picture, for the whole reality?
Constantly. It's almost the default human condition, you could argue. And what's fascinating here is that meaning fundamentally emerges from this relationship, this tension. The marked state only exists because of what it excludes. You absolutely need that background. Expert speaker. Without the background of the unmarked, the mark itself would be meaningless.
Okay, so if one distinction is that powerful, creating content and context, what happens when we start layering them? You know, when we categorize things like in business, creating market segments, or in science, classifying species, we're drawing boundary after boundary.
Right, and that's how we build up complexity from this simple operation. Let's say we're sorting customer profiles, like you mentioned. We distinguish category A, maybe high spenders, and category B, frequent buyers. We make these two marks within our total universe of customers. Now, we haven't just created A and B, we've also implicitly created X.
X being everything else.
Exactly. X is the remainder. It's everything in that background space that is neither A nor B.
The customers who aren't high spenders and aren't frequent buyers, or maybe they're one but not the other if our definitions were strict.
Yep.
But basically, the rest.
The rest. And importantly, in this system that Spencer Brown lays out, A and B are mutually exclusive. They have to be, because they are separate marks made within that same enabling background. And this leads to a kind of formal pattern in categorization. If you make any distinctions, you actually create M+1 categories.
So 5 marketing segments means 6 total possibilities, the 5 segments plus the remainder pile.
Precisely. That remainder is always there.
Okay, I'm following the remainder part. But that brings us to the core idea of this dive, the persistent unmarked state. Because that remainder X, the leftover customers, we could potentially analyze them later, right? Give them their own category. So what is the persistent unmarked state if it's not just the current leftovers.
Yes, this is the really crucial conceptual leap. You've hit it. The persistent unmarked state isn't just the remainder X, which you could mark later. It's the fundamental insight that something always remains unmarked, no matter how many distinctions you make. Regardless of how extensively you carve up your space with categories and boundaries, there is always an underlying unmarked background. And it's that background which enables those markings to have any meaning at all.
Okay, wait. So the remainder X is like the stuff we haven't defined yet. But the persistent unmarked state is more like the method, the assumptions we use to create A and B in the first place.
That's a fantastic way to put it, yes. The persistent unmarked state is the condition that enables thinking and categorizing itself. Think about a really common distinction like hot versus cold. We treat it like a simple dichotomy. We might argue about, where exactly the line is, what temperature counts as hot, but what remains unmarked? What's the persistent background?
Like the fact we're using a temperature scale at all, Fahrenheit or Celsius.
Exactly. And our cultural norms about what feels hot or cold, our own physiology, the specific instruments we're using to measure, all those underlying, usually unexamined assumptions, that's the persistent, unmarked context. It makes the distinction hot versus cold meaningful, but we can't simultaneously use that framework and step outside it to examine the framework itself.
Wow, okay, that clarifies it completely. It means every single time we define a problem or create a strategy or even just label something, we are, by definition, ignoring the very framework of assumptions that made that definition possible in the first place. It's invisible ink.
Precisely. And this structural limit, this inability to fully observe the context of your own observation, it connects directly to some well-known, really classic problems in formal systems, especially systems that try to be totally comprehensive.
Okay, I think I know where you're going, like systems trying to define themselves. Is the persistent, unmarked state sort of analogous to the limitations we see in things like set theory or mathematical logic?
The connection is definitely there. It's powerful and analogous, reflecting the same deep dilemma of self-reference. This idea that no system can fully contain or describe itself. It pops up again and again in formal logic and mathematics.
Can you give us the classic examples? Refresh our memory.
Sure. The most famous is probably Russell's paradox. Bertrand Russell found this contradiction when logicians were trying to create these completely comprehensive sets. Specifically, he asked about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If you try to define that, well, does that set contain itself? Either way, you get a logical paradox. It breaks down.
Right. The barber paradox is similar, isn't it? The barber who shaves all men who don't shave themselves. Does he shave himself?
Exactly the same logical structure. And then, even more profoundly, you have Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel proved, essentially, that any formal system complex enough to include basic arithmetic will inevitably contain statements that are true, but which cannot actually be proven using the rules within that system. And furthermore, to prove that the system itself is consistent, you have to rely on principles or axioms from outside the system.
Okay, so the big lesson from math, logic, and now systems thinking seems to be the same. Host-speaker. Complete self-inclusion appears to be impossible. Host-speaker. There is always something outside the system that the system requires for its own meaning or consistency, but it cannot fully capture that outside within its own terms.
That's exactly right. And the persistent unmarked state applies this very limitation directly to us, the observer. If you are the one making the distinction, drawing the boundary, you are the source of that form. You cannot simultaneously mark your own position as the observer making the mark, because the very act of marking requires a background, a context, that you cannot pull into the foreground at the same time. There's always something unmarked that enables the marking process itself, your own standpoint.
Wow. This feels crucial for understanding why we hit walls sometimes, conceptually. If we connect this to the bigger picture, say in business strategy or scientific research, it sort of explains why we can never achieve total, final, definitive knowledge within any single closed framework, whether it's a business model, a scientific paradigm, whatever. There's always a structural blind spot, that persistent, unmarked space that, ironically, allows us to see in the first place.
Yes, it's the necessary condition for observation itself.
So if we accept this structural limitation, right, that our frameworks, our ways of seeing, are built on this invisible foundation, what does that mean practically? How should we approach knowledge categories, problems in our everyday work or life?
Well, the most immediate implication is the need for what we might call epistemic humility. If our tools for understanding the world, our categories, our models, rest on these unmarked assumptions and background conditions, then we have to hold those tools lightly, We have to recognize what they are. They're incredibly useful for navigating experience, for making sense of things, for acting. But they are not perfect mirrors of some independent, objective reality out there. They are, in a sense, useful inventions.
I actually find that idea, holding our tools lightly, incredibly freeing. It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from arguing endlessly about whether my category or your category is right, and towards examining the process of categorization itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the practical application. It's about developing a habit of self-reflection on our own distinction making. When you face a tough situation, maybe a project fails, a relationship gets strained, the market shifts unexpectedly, the valuable question isn't just what went wrong according to my current framework. It's also, what assumptions am I making that allow me to even define this as a failure or a shift? What remains unmarked in how I'm seeing this? What alternatives, what contexts are invisible to me because they're outside my current frame?
Can you give an example, maybe in a business context?
Sure. Imagine a company labels a whole division as underperforming. Okay. The marked state is clear. Low revenue, missed targets, whatever the metric is, that's the content. But what might be the persistent unmarked state? The background assumptions. It could be a deeply ingrained, unstated company culture that actually rewards internal competition over collaboration. Or maybe there's an unwritten rule discouraging honest communication across departments. These background conditions, these unmarked norms, are what make the label underperforming seem like a natural conclusion within that company's context. But they're rarely discussed as part of the problem itself.
That makes the whole idea really actionable. It forces you to look beyond the immediate symptom, doesn't it? And this need for different perspectives, for someone else maybe to point out those unmarked contexts. That's why this strongly supports intellectual pluralism, right?
It's really the foundation for why intellectual pluralism isn't just nice, but necessary. This structural reality, the persistent unmarked state, explains why different observers can look at the very same phenomenon and make legitimately, radically different distinctions about it. The distinctions someone makes depend entirely on their purpose, maybe their biological senses, certainly their cultural background and training.
Like a biologist and an economist looking at the same rainforest.
Perfect example. The biologist marks distinctions about biodiversity, species interaction, ecological stability. That's their framework, their purpose. The economist, looking at the exact same forest, marks distinctions about timber value, potential for agriculture, opportunity cost, a completely different set of marks. Their truths about the rainforest are both valid within the frameworks they've chosen to use, but those frameworks rest on entirely different sets of unmarked assumptions about what value even means.
Yeah, it's not about one being right and the other wrong in some absolute sense.
Exactly. They're just using different tools, optimized for different tasks, revealing different aspects while necessarily obscuring others. Expert speaker. Different observers make different distinctions. This viewpoint supports the idea of pluralism.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, thinking about daily life. If we really take this on board, then objectivity, in that old-fashioned sense of a perfectly neutral, observer-free view, it might not just be difficult, it might be fundamentally impossible because the observer generates the context they can't simultaneously see. And that changes how we approach disagreements, doesn't it? It feels much more constructive if we can recognize, okay, we're using different tools here, making different cuts in reality, rather than just battling over whose single map is the true one.
It encourages dialogue about the tools themselves, about the assumptions. The wisdom lies in skillfully working with multiple perspectives, multiple maps, while always trying to be aware of what each map necessarily leaves out, what remains unmarked. The limitation is also, in a strange way, a source of freedom. It forces us to keep exploring, keep questioning our own frames.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together. Spencer Brown's really simple insight that every distinction, every mark, creates both the marked and the unmarked. It tells us that the very condition necessary for meaning actually resides outside the specific meaning we create, in the background. And this realization leads us towards, needing epistemic humility, like you said, and really embracing intellectual pluralism. No single framework, no single map can ever capture the whole territory.
Mm-hmm. And this is absolutely central to cybernetics and systems thinking. That unmarked space always exceeds our attempts to fully mark it, to fully contain it. We, the observer, can't just factor ourselves out of the equation, which is exactly what Heinz von Forster meant with that famous, slightly provocative quote, expert speaker. Objectivity is a subject's delusion that observing can be done without him.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it, a delusion. It reframes this whole idea of limitation. It's not a bug, it's a feature, it's not a deficit in our thinking, but actually a fundamental, necessary aspect of how minds engage with a complex world. Our environment, as we perceive it, it's an active construction, not just a passive reception.
Precisely. Von Forster really emphasized that the environment, as we perceive it, is our invention. We create these neat frameworks, these tidy categories, to carve up the world into bits we can handle. But we have to remember that every single framework, every model, every theory commits the same fundamental, well, not error, but simplification. They erase the presence of the observer who made the distinctions in the first place. And they ignore that vast, persistent, unmarked space of assumptions, context, excluded possibilities that makes their tidy categories seem meaningful at all.
Which means that real thinking, deep thinking, is always an ongoing process. It happens within contexts we can never fully step outside of. But recognizing that actually opens us up, doesn't it? To continuous learning, to seeing familiar situations in profoundly new ways, just by asking that simple question. What did I leave in the background? What's unmarked here?
That persistent, unmarked state. It's the infinite space for curiosity, for new distinctions, for learning.
Absolutely. Well, we really encourage you, the listener, to read more of Herischer's reflections. He goes deep on cybernetics, systems thinking. You can find his work on his blog, herischesnotebook.wordpress.com.
And if you're interested in connecting with others, exploring these kinds of ideas, definitely check out the CyberSyn community. That's spelled CYB3RSYN. Lots of great discussions happening there.
So wrapping up, what does this all mean for you? If every category you use, every way you define your world is built on these foundational assumptions you can't easily see, what's one core assumption about your biggest challenge right now that might still be sitting there in the unmarked state? Something to mull over, maybe explore on your own.
Stay curious.
And always keep on learning.